Victoria Hall had always imagined that moving into her own home would be the beginning of a quieter, more grounded chapter in her life. A chance to focus on her work as a landscape designer and to create a space that was entirely her own. A sanctuary from the hurried noise of clients' demands and the constant back and forth of project deadlines. She had spent years saving, working extra hours, taking on side projects, and finally, last spring, she signed the papers for a small but charming single-story house in a suburban neighborhood that, at first glance, seemed like the kind of place where people nodded hello over their hedges and looked out for each other in a mild, unspoken way. Her property was a corner lot, giving her a wider side yard than most, and from the moment she moved in she began carefully designing the garden to suit her taste. Layered flower beds, winding stone paths, clusters of perennials that would bloom in, waves from early spring to late autumn. It was her pride and joy, and even though the work was tiring, she loved every second she spent kneeling in the soil or rearranging pots on the patio. Across the back fence, however, lay a parcel of land that technically belonged to the neighborhood association, an open, unmaintained plot where a towering, dead poplar tree had stood for as long as anyone could remember. Its bark had peeled away in long, brittle strips, the trunk leaning at a dangerous angle toward Victoria's home, the skeletal branches extending like brittle claws over her roofline. From the day she first saw it during her initial viewing of the property, the sight of that tree had unsettled her. She mentioned it to the real estate agent, who brushed it off with a casual remark about how the association was responsible for these things, and would surely deal with it if it ever became a problem. In the months after moving in, Victoria made several polite written requests to the association's board, asking them to assess the tree and consider removing it. She worded her emails carefully, attaching photos from different angles, pointing out the risk to her home should the tree fall in a storm, and even offering to contribute to the cost of removal if budget was a concern. Each time she received either no response or a vague acknowledgement followed by nothing. On one occasion, a woman named Karen Fletcher, her across-the-road neighbor and a vocal presence at community meetings, responded tersely that the poplar was part of the neighborhood's natural landscape and should be left alone to stand as long as nature intended. Karen's tone, even in email, carried a kind of finality, as though the matter was already closed and Victoria's concern was an overreaction. But the angle of the trunk told a different story. By late summer, Victoria could see that the lean had become more pronounced. When she stood at the edge of her garden and looked up, it felt as though the topmost branches were reaching directly toward her bedroom window. Each gust of wind set the limbs creaking, a hollow sound that made her shoulders tense. Friends who visited noticed it too, sometimes stepping back from the sight and saying, half joking, that she might want to sleep on the other side of the house during a storm. Victoria didn't laugh. Her instincts told her it was only a matter of time before the tree came down, and the fact that no one seemed willing to address the hazard left her with an uneasy, constant awareness, the way you might feel if you knew a loose tile was hanging above your doorway but were told not to touch it. By September, she had sent her last email on the subject, this time marked urgent, again attaching photographs that showed the worsening tilt and a close-up of a deep crack spiraling through the base. The only reply came from Karen again, who wrote that nature has its own way of dealing with old trees, and suggested that Victoria focus on maintaining her own property before criticizing others. The response wasn't just dismissive, it felt pointed, a deliberate way of putting her in her place. Victoria closed the message without replying, but a quiet frustration took root in her mind. She had moved here for peace and stability, not to fight over something so obviously dangerous. Yet, as she stood in her garden one crisp autumn afternoon, staring at that dead poplar looming over her roof, she couldn't shake the thought that this wasn't just about a tree, but about the way certain people decided they knew best, even if it meant someone else would pay the price when their stubbornness caught up with them. It was a Tuesday morning in mid-October. the kind of morning when the air hangs heavy with the smell of damp leaves and the light is pale enough to make everything seem a little washed out. Victoria had been working in her kitchen, quietly measuring coffee grounds into the filter, when a deep, resonant crack split the air, so loud and sudden that she nearly dropped the glass carafe in her hands. It was not the dry snap of a small branch breaking, but something weightier, the kind of sound that seems to echo in your chest a split second before your mind catches up to what it is. She froze for an instant, trying to place the noise, and then it came again, another low groan of stressed wood, followed by the sharper splintering of fibers tearing apart. Instinct moved her before thought did. She hurried to the back door and flung it open just in time to see the dead poplar leaning, tilting, and then giving way entirely. The whole thing happened in a slow, horrifying arc, the massive trunk pivoting toward her house with an inevitability that made her breath catch. The brittle branches scraped the sky and then crashed through her roof with a violence that felt amplified in the still morning air. Shingles flew like cards tossed into the wind, and she heard the sickening, muffled thud of the trunk's weight settling into the structure, followed almost immediately by the shattering of glass from somewhere inside. For a moment, she simply stood there on the porch, her pulse roaring in her ears, taking in the surreal sight. The tree, now partially sprawled across her roof, the jagged wound it had opened in the shingles exposing the dark interior of her attic, and the fine dust of debris drifting down like snow. She could smell raw, torn wood mixed with the faint odor of insulation. Somewhere beneath it all was the quiet ticking sound of something still shifting, like bones settling after a fall. Her first thought, ridiculous and yet somehow deeply ingrained, was whether she should move her car from the driveway in case anything else came down, but that thought was immediately replaced by the more pressing one. She needed to call for help. She pulled out her phone and dialed emergency services, her voice steadier than she felt as she explained that a large tree had fallen onto her house and there might be structural damage. The dispatcher assured her someone would be sent to assess safety and clear the scene if necessary. Less than 20 minutes later, she heard the rumble of a truck pulling up outside, but it wasn't the fire department or a city crew. It was Karen, stepping out of the passenger side of a black pickup along with two men in heavy work jackets that bore no company logo. The men didn't waste time with introductions. They went straight to the tree, starting up chainsaws and cutting away sections of the upper branches with the kind of speed that suggested they had done this before. Karen approached Victoria with a briskness that felt more like intrusion than concern, holding herself with that faint tilt of the chin that made her look as though she were already explaining something to a less informed party. "Well," she began, sweeping a glance over the damage as though it were a curiosity rather than a crisis, "looks like nature finally took care of that old thing. I told you it would happen eventually." Her tone was not sympathetic. It was almost smug, as if this confirmed something she had been waiting to prove. Victoria tried to steady her voice, asking why the men were cutting the tree before any official inspection had taken place. Karen waved the question off with a casual flick of her hand, saying they were just making the scene safe, and that it was better to get the debris off the roof quickly before it caused more damage. But as Victoria's gaze shifted from Karen to the men, she noticed something that made her stomach tighten. The cut at the base of the trunk, where the break had supposedly occurred, was unnaturally straight and smooth for something that had fallen naturally. The pale wood of the inner trunk was fresh, unmarred by rot at the point where it had split. She moved closer, ignoring Karen's faintly exasperated sigh, and crouched down near one of the thick sections the men had already brought to the ground. Her eyes traced the cut line, clean and even, with none of the ragged tearing she would expect from a tree simply giving way under its own weight. The realization was like a drop of ice water down her spine. This tree hadn't just fallen, it had been helped along. Karen, noticing where she was looking, stepped into her line of sight with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "These things always look strange when they break," she said lightly, but her voice carried the faintest undertone of warning. "The important thing is that no one was hurt." She then added, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, that the cost of repairing the roof would be Victoria's responsibility, since the tree had fallen due to natural causes. The words hit with a kind of dull finality. Natural causes. She knew what Karen was doing. Framing it this way meant there would be no acknowledgement of liability, no offer of help, no admission that any prior warning had been ignored. In that moment, Victoria understood that she wasn't dealing with a simple accident or an unfortunate act of nature, but with a situation that had already been shaped and spun in someone else's favor. Before she could respond, one of the men called out that they were almost finished clearing the dangerous sections. She wanted to tell them to stop, to leave everything exactly as it was until someone impartial could see it, but she hesitated. These were people who clearly operated with a sense of entitlement over what happened here, and she was standing alone in her own yard with little more than the phone in her pocket. She made a quick decision. Rather than confront them directly, she would document what she could while she still had the chance. She pulled her phone out again, angling it in a way that made it seem as if she were just checking messages, and quietly captured several close shots of the fresh cut, the pattern of the splintering, and the way the trunk lay in relation to the rest of the yard. By the time the men were packing their chainsaws back into the truck, Karen was already talking about how these situations were best handled quickly and without dragging in unnecessary outside parties. Her tone was dismissive, but her eyes lingered on Victoria with a sharpness that made it clear she was measuring her reaction. Victoria only nodded, her mind already shifting into a different gear, one where the shock of the moment was giving way to the realization that she was going to have to be careful, deliberate, and absolutely certain about her next steps. What had just happened to her home wasn't an accident, and deep down she suspected that Karen knew exactly how and why the tree had fallen the way it did. Victoria spent the rest of that morning in a kind of dazed efficiency, making calls, answering the same questions from different people, and trying to keep her voice calm even as she felt an unfamiliar tightness building in her chest. When the first police officer finally arrived, she almost felt relief. Finally, someone with authority who could look at the situation without the bias she was already sensing from Karen and her two silent helpers. But the relief didn't last long. The officer, a tall man with a neutral expression that never quite shifted into concern, walked the perimeter of the yard with a small notepad, jotting down a few details but never getting close enough to examine the suspiciously clean cut she had seen earlier. When she mentioned it, he paused, squinting toward the fallen trunk, then gave a small shrug and said that trees could break in strange ways depending on grain and weight distribution, especially if the wood had been stressed for a long time. His tone was polite but carried the quiet finality of someone closing a door. He advised her to work it out with the property's owner, and if necessary, pursue a civil claim, but there was nothing he could determine as a criminal matter. When he left, Victoria stood in the driveway watching the patrol car pull away, feeling as if she'd just been patted on the head and sent back to her room. That feeling hardened into something colder when she checked her mailbox later that afternoon and found a crisp, folded notice addressed to her. It was from the neighborhood's maintenance committee, though she knew without reading past the first line exactly whose hand had been in drafting it, informing her that she was in violation of community standards for the accumulation of construction debris visible from the street. The debris, of course, being the shattered remains of the poplar that had crushed her roof barely 3 hours earlier. The letter went on to say that she had 7 days to remove the material or face escalating fines. The absurdity of it might have been almost funny if it hadn't been so transparent. The tree had fallen, they had rushed to control the cleanup in a way that destroyed evidence, and now they were framing her as negligent for not removing what they themselves had left behind. By evening, she was on the phone with her insurance company, walking the representative through the events of the morning. The agent, a woman with a tone of forced sympathy, listened carefully and then explained, almost apologetically, that because the tree had been on neighboring land, and there was no conclusive proof of negligence, the damage fell under her own homeowner's policy and she would be responsible for the deductible. When Victoria asked about the possibility of pursuing the neighbor's liability, the agent said that would require a formal claim against them, and even then it would be difficult without clear documentation or third-party assessment made before the cleanup. In other words, the very thing she had been denied when Karen's crew swept in to cut apart the trunk. The rest of the week unfolded like a slow tightening of a noose. Every day she found herself making yet another call, to a roofing contractor, to a structural engineer, to her attorney friend Alex, while also dealing with the constant reminder that her home was damaged and vulnerable. She had to move her bed into the guest room to avoid sleeping beneath the gaping hole that had been hastily covered with a blue tarp, its edges flapping in the wind like a flag of surrender. Every gust of air seemed to carry in the faint scent of wet insulation, and at night she could hear the distant creak of wood as the damaged beams adjusted under their new weight distribution. Alex came by on Thursday, walking the property with her and listening without interruption as she laid out every detail she could remember. He took photographs, careful to capture angles that still showed the nature of the cuts on the remaining sections of trunk that Karen's crew hadn't hauled away. He also photographed the notice in her mailbox, shaking his head when he read it. "This isn't subtle," he said. "They're making moves to frame you as the problem. It's deliberate." He advised her not to engage directly with Karen or anyone claiming to act on behalf of the committee, and to route all further communication through him. The more you talk to them directly, the more they'll try to twist your words into something they can use against you. That night, as if on cue, there was a knock at her door just past 9 o'clock. She almost didn't answer, but the sound came again, sharper this time, and when she opened it she found Karen herself standing there, arms crossed loosely but with that same faintly amused expression Victoria had seen earlier in the week. Karen said she had heard from a few neighbors that Victoria was upset about how the situation had been handled and thought she might offer some advice on avoiding unnecessary trouble. It was delivered as if Karen were doing her a kindness, though. Every syllable felt like a warning. Victoria thanked her flatly and said all matters would now be handled through her attorney, then closed the door before Karen could reply. The next morning, she found that the tarp covering the hole in her roof had been pulled loose on one side, as if by wind, except the forecast had been calm all night. She also noticed footprints in the soft earth beneath the overhang, not her own, leading to the side gate. She stood there for a long moment, jaw tightening, then went inside to call Alex. He told her to document it immediately, which she did, even though part of her wondered how many of these small, unsettling details would ever amount to anything in a legal sense. But the other part of her, the part that had been watching this dead tree lean further toward her house for months, knew that these were not accidents or coincidences. They were pieces of a plan, and the people behind it were counting on her to either give up or make a mistake they could use. She had no intention of doing either. By the time the second week rolled around, Victoria's days had fallen into a rhythm she hadn't chosen and didn't want. Mornings spent chasing contractors, afternoons trading emails with her attorney, and evenings listening for noises outside she couldn't quite dismiss. The roofers had managed to install a temporary support frame in the attic to relieve pressure on the damaged rafters, but the gash in the shingles still yawned under the tarp like a wound, vulnerable to every shift in weather. Each time she saw it from the street, it felt less like an accident and more like a scar someone had deliberately carved into her home. She kept thinking about the clean cut on that poplar trunk and the speed with which Karen's crew had arrived, the way they had sliced it up and hauled away the pieces before anyone else could see what she had seen. She knew it wasn't just bad luck, but knowing and proving it were worlds apart. Alex had been moving quietly but deliberately, filing formal requests for maintenance records from the committee, submitting notices that any further intrusion on her property would be considered trespassing, and pressing for an independent inspection of the tree remnants. The first two requests were ignored outright. The third came back with a short reply claiming the tree had already been disposed of for public safety, accompanied by a single low-resolution photograph of the remaining stump taken from a distance. The angle was so poor that it concealed the cut entirely. It was the kind of insult that masqueraded as compliance, and it only hardened Victoria's resolve. Late one afternoon, she received a knock on her door. Not Karen this time, but her next-door neighbor, a soft-spoken man named Leonard who usually kept to himself. He looked uneasy, glancing over his shoulder before speaking. "I shouldn't even be here," he said, "but I thought you should know. Karen had people out there 2 nights before the tree fell. They were working on it after dark. I saw them from my upstairs window, but—" His voice trailed off and he shook his head. "I'm not getting involved." He left before she could press him for details, disappearing back into his own house with the air of a man who'd just done something both necessary and risky. That fragment of information was enough for Alex to take the next step. He advised her to file a formal incident report with the city's risk management office, not because they would necessarily act immediately, but because it would create an official paper trail documenting her concerns and the timeline leading up to the damage. The process was tedious, involving pages of forms and sworn statements, but Victoria understood the strategy. If this situation escalated further, every piece of documented history would matter. In the middle of this, the committee sent her another letter, this one claiming that her failure to maintain the aesthetic appearance of her property was causing concern among other residents, and that further inaction could lead to remedial measures at her expense. Reading between the lines, Victoria understood it for what it was, an open declaration that they were preparing to take matters into their own hands again, just as they had with the tree. Alex's advice was the same as before. Don't respond directly, don't give them any language they could twist, and let him handle it. Still, it was hard to ignore the tightening sense of siege. Then came the moment that shifted everything from defensive maneuvering to active counterplay. The city's risk management office, perhaps out of obligation, sent an inspector to at least look at the site. The man was older, with the kind of deliberate movements that suggested he'd been doing this a long time. He walked the property with her, asked about the sequence of events, and examined what little was left of the stump in the adjacent lot. After several minutes, he crouched down and traced a finger along the exposed wood, then looked up at her with a frown. "This isn't a natural break," he said quietly. "Somebody cut into this. The way the fibers are severed, the angle. It's deliberate." He stopped short of offering anything in writing right there, but he didn't need to. The look on his face told her he knew exactly what had been done. 2 days later, Alex received a copy of the inspector's preliminary notes, which were couched in cautious, non-committal language but still contained enough to matter. The tree showed evidence of prior mechanical alteration, and the manner of its fall was consistent with directional felling techniques. Those phrases, Alex explained, were as close as the inspector could come to saying it was cut down on purpose without opening himself to direct accusation. But in legal terms, it was more than they'd had before. It was a wedge they could use. When Karen learned about the inspection, her demeanor shifted from smug condescension to thinly veiled hostility. Victoria noticed her more often now, lingering near the property line, sometimes standing with her phone in hand as if she were recording something. Twice, she caught Karen speaking with other neighbors in low tones, gesturing toward Victoria's house with a tilt of her head. Whatever story Karen was telling, it was spreading. That undercurrent of social pressure, the disapproving looks from people who used to wave, the sudden coldness in brief exchanges, was nearly as exhausting as the legal fight. One evening, returning from a meeting with Alex, Victoria found a folded sheet of paper tucked into her front door frame. It was unsigned, but the handwriting was careful, almost formal. "Stop making trouble before it becomes worse for you." She read it twice, her pulse thudding in her ears, then slipped it into a file folder without telling anyone but Alex. "Keep it," he said. "Don't react. These people want to provoke you into a mistake. Let them think you're just quietly going about your business while we build the case." That night, lying in the guest room, she listened to the wind tug at the edges of the tarp and realized the balance had shifted. She was no longer simply reacting to what had been done to her. She and Alex now had a foothold, however small, in proving intent. It wasn't enough yet to win, but it was enough to keep her from feeling like she was standing alone on the defensive. And for the first time since the poplar had crashed through her roof, she allowed herself to think not just about repairing the damage, but about holding the people responsible to account in a way they wouldn't see coming. The shift from subtle hostility to open confrontation came faster than Victoria expected, and it began with the sound of machinery outside her window early one Saturday morning. She had been in the kitchen, halfway through her first cup of coffee, when she caught the low rumble of an engine idling too close to her house. Pulling back the curtain, she saw a small crew in bright vests unloading tools from the back of a flatbed truck, their movements quick and purposeful. At the front of the group stood Karen, arms folded and chin raised, speaking to one of the workers while occasionally glancing toward Victoria's house with a look that was almost performative, as if she wanted to be seen. When Victoria stepped outside and asked what was going on, Karen answered in a tone that feigned politeness but carried an undercurrent of command. She claimed that the committee had scheduled a property line inspection and fence maintenance for her yard, and that the crew needed access immediately to remove damaged materials and restore the proper boundary. Victoria, remembering Alex's warnings, kept her voice calm but firm, stating that no work would be done on her property without her consent, and that any access would have to be approved through her attorney. Karen's expression hardened almost imperceptibly, the corners of her mouth tightening as she told the workers to stand by. Within an hour, Victoria received an email from the committee alleging that her damaged fence was a safety hazard, and that failure to authorize repairs could result in action being taken without her permission and at her expense. The language was carefully crafted to sound official, but the intent was unmistakable. They were trying to force their way back onto her property under a pretext. Alex responded on her behalf that same day, citing property laws and warning of legal consequences for any unauthorized entry. The crew left by mid-afternoon, but not before stacking several sections of fencing and hardware just beyond her driveway, as if to make a point. Later, when Victoria went outside to move the materials out of the way, she noticed fresh tire ruts pressed deep into the soil near the side gate, the same gate where she had seen footprints a week earlier. It felt less like a coincidence and more like a reminder that they could come close whenever they wanted. 2 days later, the pressure escalated again. She returned home from running errands to find a bright orange notice taped to her front door, informing her that she was being fined for unauthorized exterior modifications to her roof. The so-called modifications, of course, were nothing more than the temporary repairs the roofing contractor had installed to keep rain out of the damaged attic. It was absurd on its face, but Victoria knew the tactic: bury her in accusations and fines, hoping the mounting stress and expense would push her into either abandoning her challenge or making a hasty agreement. She scanned the notice, sent a copy to Alex, and filed it with the growing stack of documents that now occupied half her dining room table. By midweek, the hostility had moved beyond paperwork. Coming back from a late meeting, she noticed that one of the security lights on the side of her house wasn't working. A closer look revealed that the bulb had been unscrewed just enough to break contact. The same night, she heard the metallic rattle of her trash bin being tipped over and found it lying on its side in the morning, contents strewn across the driveway. Small incidents, easily dismissed as accidents to anyone else, but to her they were part of a pattern, a steady, deliberate erosion of her sense of control over her own home. Alex urged her to keep documenting everything, even the smallest disturbances. He also filed for a temporary restraining order that would bar Karen or anyone acting under her direction from entering her property. The filing itself seemed to provoke a reaction. The very next day, Karen appeared at the edge of the property line while Victoria was watering her garden, loudly telling another neighbor that some people just can't live peacefully and make trouble where there's none. The neighbor, clearly uncomfortable, nodded without engaging, but the performance had served its purpose, making Victoria out to be the aggressor in the eyes of anyone watching. That Friday, the tension broke into something more overt. Victoria woke to the sound of a ladder scraping against the side of her house. Throwing on a jacket, she stepped outside to find two men, neither of whom she recognized, halfway up the wall, inspecting the gutter near the damaged section of roof. When she demanded to know what they were doing, one of them muttered something about checking for further storm damage before descending. She told them plainly that they were trespassing and that the police would be called immediately. The men exchanged a quick look, then left without argument, their retreating figures casting long shadows in the early light. She called Alex before she even went back inside, her hands still shaking. The incident galvanized her. The restrained approach she had been taking, waiting, documenting, letting Alex handle the legal maneuvers, was still the right strategy, but it was becoming clearer that her opponents were not going to back down simply because the law was on her side. They were testing her boundaries, both physically and mentally, looking for any sign that she might falter. Standing in her yard that evening, watching the tarp flutter in the wind over the hole in her roof, she realized that the line between nuisance and intimidation had already been crossed, and from here on out, every move she made would need to be not just careful but unshakable. The hearing was set for a Thursday morning in late November, the kind of cold, windless day that felt heavy with its own silence. Victoria arrived early with Alex, carrying a slim folder that contained weeks of photographs, correspondence, and the inspector's cautious but telling notes. She had been in courtrooms before for jury duty, but walking into this one with her own case on the docket felt different. The air seemed denser, the walls closer. Across the aisle, Karen sat, flanked by a man in an expensive suit and two members of the committee, all of them leaning in toward one another as they spoke in low, measured tones. When their eyes met, Karen offered the faintest smile, one that seemed designed to convey certainty of victory. The proceedings began with the opposing counsel laying out their version of events. The poplar had been dead for years, weakened by age and internal decay, and had finally succumbed to natural environmental forces. They presented a single photograph of the tree stump, taken after it had been cut flush with the ground, that showed no obvious signs of tampering. The attorney's voice was confident, almost bored, as he framed Victoria's claims as speculative and her evidence as subjective impressions. It was a strategy that might have worked if that was all the judge heard. When it was Alex's turn, he stood without rushing, flipping open his notes but keeping his eyes on the judge. He began with the timeline. The repeated warnings Victoria had sent about the leaning tree, the refusal to remove it, the sudden appearance of workers within minutes of it falling, and the rapid cutting and removal of large sections before any official inspection could take place. He then produced the city inspector's report, reading aloud the key phrases: prior mechanical alteration and directional felling techniques, and explaining in plain language what they meant. As he spoke, he projected high-resolution photographs Victoria had taken that morning, showing the smooth, deliberate cut lines and the fresh, unweathered wood beneath the bark. The turning point came when Alex introduced a surprise witness, Leonard, the quiet neighbor who had first come to Victoria with what he'd seen. She hadn't known until that moment whether he would actually appear, but there he was, stepping up to the stand with his hands clasped tightly in front of him. In a voice that wavered at first but grew steadier, he described seeing Karen's crew at the base of the tree 2 nights before it fell, using headlamps and working in near silence. He admitted he hadn't taken photographs, but his account lined up with the timing of events Alex had already laid out. The defense tried to paint Leonard's statement as hearsay, but the judge listened without interruption, occasionally glancing at the photographs again. When the defense attorney suggested that the cut lines could have been made during the post-fall cleanup, Alex countered by showing an image of the stump that remained in the adjacent lot, taken before it was leveled, where the same angled cuts were, visible at a height consistent with controlled felling. By the time both sides had finished, the room felt different. Karen no longer looked at Victoria. Her gaze was fixed on the table in front of her, her jaw set tight. The judge spoke for several minutes about the obligation property owners had to prevent foreseeable harm to neighboring structures, noting that in this case, prior warnings had been documented and ignored, and that the physical evidence strongly suggested intervention before the fall. The ruling was clear. Karen and the committee were liable for the cost of repairing Victoria's roof, for additional structural damage caused by the impact, and for her legal expenses. There was also an additional penalty for what the judge described as reckless disregard for safety. The words landed with the weight of something final. As the gavel came down, Victoria felt a release she hadn't realized she'd been holding back, a deep exhale that seemed to empty weeks of tension from her chest. Outside, the sky was the same flat gray as when she'd arrived, but it felt different now, less oppressive. Karen and her attorney walked past without a word, their pace brisk while Alex allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. They didn't speak much on the way back to her house. There would still be repairs to finish, payments to collect, and no doubt small acts of pettiness from those who had lost, but the core of it was over. For the first time since that deafening crack in October, Victoria could look at her home without feeling as though someone else's hand was still pressing against its walls. The repairs to the roof were finished just before the first real snow of the season. The new shingles a darker shade than the rest, but clean, tight, and whole. Standing in her driveway one crisp morning, Victoria watched the last of the scaffolding come down, the clang of metal poles echoing briefly before the yard returned to stillness. The work crews were gone, the hole was gone, and with them went the daily reminder of how close she had come to losing more than just part of her house. The judgment had been entered, the first payment from Karen and the committee already transferred, and while Alex warned her that collecting the remainder might be slow, there was no longer any question about who was in the right. Neighbors who had avoided her in the weeks after the fall had started nodding again, a few even stopping to comment on how quickly the roof had been fixed, though their voices carried a cautious note, as if acknowledging her victory too directly might invite trouble for themselves. Karen, for her part, kept her distance. She no longer lingered at the property line or orchestrated crews to appear unannounced. When they did cross paths in the street, she passed with her gaze fixed elsewhere, her jaw set in that same tense line Victoria had seen in the courtroom. On the first evening after the work was complete, Victoria walked the perimeter of her yard, the air sharp with the scent of wood and cold earth. The garden was dormant now, stripped back to its winter bones, but she could already imagine how it would look come spring. Tulips pushing through the soil, the pathways clear, the house standing solid and unthreatened. For months, her home had felt like contested ground, every inch a point of leverage in someone else's power game. Now, even with the memory of the fight still fresh, it belonged to her again. She knew there might be smaller battles ahead, petty slights, unspoken grudges, but they would come to nothing if she refused to be baited. The real victory wasn't just the judgment or the repairs, it was the quiet certainty that she had stood her ground, met every escalation with patience and proof, and left those who tried to break her with nothing to hold over her. When she closed the back gate and turned toward the house, the light spilling warm from its windows, she felt the weight of the past week settle into something that was no longer a burden, but a reminder. She could be pushed, but not moved.